Hello, welcome to the channel and thanks for watching. And in this video I'm going to show you how I painted up the vicious killer bears from Endor, the Ewoks. When these came out in advance order, could not resist them and I wanted to get them painted up onto the tabletop in as quick a time as possible. So we're doing a sort of slap chop contrast inspired scheme. So we sprayed them black, then we sprayed Wraithbone, not being too precious about getting all the angles underneath covered in that whitish colour because it helps the contrast paint work a bit differently. A quick all over dry brush of off-white, not putting too much down, but this will just give an extra highlight layer for this contrast paint to work on. And then really we are now blocking in the contrast paint colours. Starting off here with Wildwood, for me the best representation of that kind of wood colour we're going to do. When we're layering this contrast paint on, we're not being too thick. You can see there if it's pooling up anywhere, I am moving it around the model. A lot of wood on these models and a lot of natural colours, so that's really what we're starting off with. Moving on to the snakebite leather, my favourite colour for leather from the contrast range, working that into all the straps, the pouches, and as you see here onto the kind of headgear that they wear. So they wear kind of like an overall hood. The vast majority of the Ewoks I'm doing with the leather hood, but because these models come in limited poses when you move off the special characters, I'm going to differentiate the poses of the models by painting some of the hoods in leather and some of the hoods in black, as you'll see. Because as you saw there, that one pose of Ewok has a sling in his hand. The next pose of that Ewok will have a spear. So to differentiate the two models a little bit more, not just based on weaponry, we're putting black onto the hoods of some of the Ewoks. Now all the colours I'm using will be the top left of the screen, will also be on a slide kind of at the end of the painting scheme you'll see. Now moving on with that black onto the feathers, you could do vibrant colourful feathers everywhere on these models, but I'm keeping the tones fairly muted as we go because they were kind of in the series, putting some pops of colour in later. Now, as they are vicious killers, they are covered in bone in various areas. So I'm using what looks like a spinal column on Logray's staff, but also Logray's hat there in Skeleton Horde to pick up on those kind of bone areas. Now I also drop a little bit onto the teeth of some of the Ewoks that have got their vicious fangs showing, and I did also drop a little bit on the very ends of the fingers where you can see the kind of fingernails, but it didn't really add much to the scheme, so I've kind of skipped showing that because the other bit I'm going to do later with the hands actually has more of an impact. And obviously the Ewoks are hunters, so we've taken the bone and put that onto the hunting horn that they blow to sow terror into the hearts of the loyalist stormtroopers defending the bases on Endor. It's a really interesting thing about the Ewoks, isn't it? Cute teddy bears that do end up butchering stormtroopers, but hey, plot armour is always an interesting thing, I suppose. Now I'm taking a flesh colour. That's an unusual choice because Ewoks are really considered to be hairy all over, but actually when you look at the end of the fingertips, there is some colour kind of showing through. So I'm taking this Guilliman flesh, putting that onto the ends of the fingers where you can see the fur isn't moulded on, also onto the noses and onto the lips of the models. As I'm saying before about when I put the bone onto the teeth, it didn't really add much impact because this kind of layer of flesh did tend to swamp it. Onto the feet as well, onto the toes. Now this is a little bit brighter than it's going to end up eventually, and you'll see the next stages. Now as much as I said I'm keeping the feathers fairly muted, I am taking a Mantis Warrior's green and putting that onto some of the feathers and also onto the moulded on leaves that are on the bases of the hornblowers you see here. Now this will also tie the colour into the basing scheme I'm going to do later on to represent the fact that it is, kind of jungle forest world. Now Basilicanum Grey, great choice for stone. So a lot of the weaponry on here you'll see is the stone axe heads, the stone spear heads, and some of the models are also stud with little stones kind of under their feet on the bases. So moving that across, we're also going to use the same grey on some of the fur later on that you're going to see. And there's nothing wrong with that really, because the techniques we're going to do on top of the fur and on top of the stone afterwards is going to really differentiate those colours. Now it's fur time, and we're going to use 4 different contrast paints: Gorgrunter Fur, Cygor Brown, Basilicanum Grey and Apothecary White to really represent the sort of grey and brown Ewoks. Starting off here with the Apothecary White over the entirety of the fur. Then when that's not dry, we're taking some Basilicanum Grey and dropping it into patches, using the still wet Apothecary White to blend that across the model. Now it does start off looking quite a dirty looking grey. You'll see this scheme at the end. We're adding some washes and stuff on top of this, and really these early models I was experimenting to see what it would really do. Taking now a Gorgrunter Fur and doing the same technique. It looks very, very dark when you first put it on camera. It does lighten up. And again, dropping Gorgrunter Fur over the whole model. Now here, I'm just testing some stripiness. So I'm taking the Cygor Brown and putting stripes of that brown. And before it has a chance to dry or disperse too much, taking the Apothecary White, painting that within that stripe, and then just merging them together on the model. And it starts to blend those patches of fur kind of in. Now, experimenting on live models might seem a strange thing to do, but I was fairly sure it was going to work. If you're not sure on the techniques yourself, you might have taken an old model somewhere or even just use a piece of sprue that you've undercoated, you know, spray a piece of sprue that the models come off and just play on there to see what the paints do. But once you're confident, you'll be all right. Now here's a mix of two paints. So this is a mix of Gorgonta Fur and Apothecary White to lighten up that fur colour. So I've mixed it off on a palette, not in the pot itself, so that it sort of brightens up the same colour. So you can use the same sort of colour furs to, you know, paint multiple models. Now here, doing something a little bit different again. So this is a 50-50 mix of Cygor Brown and Basilicanum Grey that I'm painting on the stomach area. So it's like a brighter fur colour. Then I'm taking the proper unmixed Cygor and painting that around it. So essentially the stomach is going to be lighter in fur colour than elsewhere. The rest of the fur is that original brown colour. And you can play an experiment like this. Mix in, you could use the contrast medium that you get in a pot to water it down, which I did on a couple, or you could mix it in with a lighter paint colour just to really experiment with what these fur colours do. Now when I'm painting on low grey, I'm kind of sticking to the box art, but not really, because I find the box art a little bit too bright. So you'll see here I'm taking the Apothecary White and putting horizontal stripes around his arms and vertical stripes on the body. Then I'm taking that Cygor Brown and painting in between those stripes. Now the brown really contrasts with the Apothecary White, if you excuse the pun, but when you blend those two together, it does start to take that brown and merge it into the white. And I wasn't really going for really bright white areas on him because I don't overly like how that represents on the model. I know in reality when it's scaled up you would see more white. Now what I'm doing here is with the end of the brush, when it's still got a little bit of the Cygor Brown on, just stippling it over those white areas to blend those colours in. Now we're on to Wicket, I suppose the most famous one, and this here what I've taken and done is taken some Cygor Brown, watered it down with contrast medium to about 50-50, again to make him have that little bit of a paler belly and a little bit of paler area around his face and nose. So I've not gone for quite as vibrant as the box art shows, because I want them to look a little bit darker, a little bit sort of more blended in and matching each other a little bit. If you wanted to go step brighter on his stomach and face, like the the box art sometimes shows, put a little bit more of the brighter contrast in. Now when everything is thoroughly dried, I'm taking Games Workshop Seraphim Sepia and we're giving a wash of every single part of the model and the base, and again this will darken them down a little bit more. So if any of those areas are too vibrant and pale, you do that. Now if you like the quite vibrant colour, you could maybe skip this step. You can see here when I'm putting it over the model that I've done entirely in Apothecary White, because I wanted quite a bright scheme. It does darken it down a fair bit. Now we're doing a dry brush stage here, and we're dry brushing the entire models. The whole model, the base, everything in Vallejo Bone White. Now there is very, very, very little paint on this brush, as you see, and I'm putting here, not really putting much on at all, going slightly heavier on the base and across the model not so much. And again this will tie and make the models kind of slightly dusty, slightly pulled and toned together with this bone white colour. Now be very, very careful when you're doing this stage. If you're not very good at dry brushing, really do test, really do make sure that you're dry brushing most of that paint off before it goes anywhere near a model. This will tie the models together, this will add an extra slight dusty highlight layer, and I think just finishes the models off very nicely. Speaking of finishing the models off, basing time. Now you will have seen before I did the wash, the bases suddenly became brown. That is just a simple layer of beastie brown painted on, and then once the wash has been done, they're dry brushed up with that bone white. You've seen that I dry brushed the rest of the base up, but not a lot on there, as you can see. A couple of tufts on there, some quite vibrant green tufts, and then the leaves you've seen here are some Green Stuff World leaf litter, tying really nicely to the plastic leaves on the base there, and all again just PVA glued on. Now, I was going to finish the models at that point, but decided I need to do something a little bit different with the eyes. So just taking the Games Workshop Bad and Black and dropping a tiny bit of black into the eye sockets, all the Ewoks, to give them that dead killer 1,000-yard stare. And that is the Ewoks finished. So I really enjoyed that colour scheme. Not as vibrant as the box art, but I personally like things that little bit darker. Each Ewok has got a slightly different fur tone, as you'll see here, and I really like how the basing and things ties them all together. So an enjoyable scheme. Really glad I picked these up for Star Wars Legion. I hope you guys don't mind the fact that my channel sometimes bounces off onto a tangent like this. Predominantly 40k at the moment and going back to 40k again soon, but could not resist these ones. And again, I did pick up the AT-AT with them as well, so at some point that will appear on the channel. So if you did like that, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, and hopefully I will see you on another video.